Hi, I'm Rachel. Last Friday, I stepped off a plane from my husband's funeral with a folded flag in my arms and hoped that someone from my family would be waiting. Instead, I walked into the freezing curbside air alone, my breath turning white, my phone buzzing with the words, "We're busy." Try Uber. My brother sent it. My mother followed with, "You should have planned better." No hug. No, I'm sorry. Just cold silence in the middle of March. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing it wasn't just one cruel afternoon. It was years of quiet dismissal, being invisible at their tables, carrying their emergencies, and getting erased when it mattered most. All crashing down on that curb outside the airport. So, what do you think happened after I closed that group chat for good? Before we dive in, tell me, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. I read every one. The wind cut through my coat like it had teeth. Diesel fumes rose from the idling buses. Somewhere behind me, a child squealed when she spotted her father. I kept my eyes on the blacktop. I didn't wave for a cab. Didn't scroll ride-share apps. I just stood there, flag tight against my ribs, watching the sliding doors hiss open and shut. Then the SUV pulled up. Glossy, black, unhurried. The driver stepped out, opened the back door without a word. 3 Marines emerged, 2 women, 1 man. Full dress, boots hitting the pavement like a drumbeat. They didn't smile. Didn't ask questions. They stood at my back, forming a wall between me and the rest of the world. The air smelled of jet fuel and coffee gone bitter. I slid into the seat, leather cold against my legs, flag still pressed to my chest. 1 Marine closed the door gently, like sealing a promise. As we drove away, I caught the terminal shrinking in the tinted glass. Crowds hugging, kissing, crying. The kind of welcome I used to imagine I'd get from my own blood. My phone lit again. Group chat. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. That night, the news aired the footage. My black coat, my red-rimmed eyes, the flag. The 3 Marines flanking me like sentinels. The anchor's voice was smooth, measured. Today, a widow returned from her husband's funeral alone, but not unnoticed. Then the camera zoomed on my hands, passing a small white box to the sergeant. On screen, my handwriting. If you ever find yourself standing alone at the edge of grief, don't look for the people who left you there. Look for the ones who show up anyway. They didn't have to say my name. Everyone in that group chat knew. I imagined my brother's fork frozen mid-air, my mother's wine glass slipping in her grip, their kitchens suddenly too quiet. The next morning, the chat was silent. No reactions, no apologies, just the same void they'd left me in at the curb. I poured coffee, stared at the steam curling into nothing. I could almost hear my husband's voice. Steady, teasing. If they ever show you who they are, believe them. I believed. And I also knew something else. Silence can be punishment, but it can also be the start of a plan. Because while they were busy pretending nothing happened, I'd already started deciding exactly how to make sure they never forgot. Before that March afternoon, before the curbside silence, there was us. Liam and I met on a rainy Thursday at the base commissary. He was in uniform, standing in the coffee aisle, staring at 2 brands like the decision carried national weight. I reached past him for a bag. He smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile that tries too hard. It was the kind that feels like it's been waiting. We built our life between deployments. Small apartments near bases, boxes never fully unpacked. A couch bought secondhand in Virginia, still smelling faintly of someone else's cologne. We learned to make anniversaries out of Tuesdays. Dinner at the diner off Route 9, jukebox playing something too loud, his hand covering mine. When he was away, I kept the home front steady, paid bills, fixed leaks, sent care packages with socks and candy he never admitted he needed. I also took calls from his family, birthday reminders, loan requests, last-minute babysitting. I said yes to all of it because I thought that's what family meant. Showing up, even when it's inconvenient. There were signs, though. Little things that, at the time, felt like nothing. A cousin's wedding I wasn't invited to. My mother-in-law forgetting my name when introducing me to someone at church. Comments about real family and blood ties. I'd smile, tuck the sting away, tell myself they didn't mean it. Liam noticed. He'd squeeze my shoulder, lean in and whisper, "Ignore them. We know the truth." And I believed him. Because when he was home, the noise faded. He made pancakes on Sundays, always burning the first one. He folded my laundry wrong but insisted on doing it. We'd sit on the porch with coffee, watching the light change on the fence, the quiet wrapping around us like something we could keep. The last year was the hardest. His deployment stretched longer than planned. Our calls got shorter, his voice thinner over the line. He wrote letters, real ones, with smudged ink where his hand dragged. He told me about the heat, the sand, the way time bent in the desert. When the knock came that morning, I already knew. 2 Marines at my door, faces carved from stone. The words were careful, rehearsed. "We regret to inform you." The rest blurred. All I remember is the weight in my knees, the sound of my own breathing too loud. In those first hours, his family called. They cried. They promised to be there for me. And for a moment, I thought maybe all the years of belonging were behind us. I didn't know yet how fast those promises could melt. The days between the knock and the funeral felt like walking through wet cement. Everything was slow, heavy, permanent. The military took over the details. Flights, accommodations, the honor guard schedule. They moved with precision, a choreography that left no space for my own staggering steps. His family arrived in clusters. Hugs at the door, casseroles in foil pans, voices pitched just enough to sound broken. They asked where the guest rooms were. They asked about the schedule. No one asked how I was sleeping. At the viewing, I stood beside his casket for hours. His dress blues fit him perfectly, medals polished until they caught the light. The folded flag waited at the end like a punctuation mark on the wrong sentence. People filed past, friends from every base, neighbors, commanders. Some cried openly, some pressed my hands. When his mother approached, her eyes stayed on the flag. "Your last duty," she murmured, like I was staff, not his wife. The morning of the burial, frost clung to the grass. Breath rose from every mouth like smoke. I could feel the metal of the flagpole through my gloves as I gripped it, waiting. 21 rifles cracked the air. Each shot seemed to knock something loose inside me. They handed me the flag. Tight folds, edges sharp enough to cut. The chaplain's words swam around me, broken by the thud of dirt hitting wood. After the service, I expected. What exactly? A ride back to the hotel. A moment to sit, to breathe. Instead, his family clustered together, speaking in low voices, glancing at their watches. I caught fragments. "Busy when we get back. Flight's at 6. Someone mentioned a dinner reservation. That night, in the small hotel room, I packed my black dress into the same suitcase I'd brought for weddings, holidays, anniversaries. The zipper caught on the lining. I yanked it free. My phone sat dark on the nightstand. The morning flight home was quiet. I kept the flag on my lap the entire time, ignoring the in-flight coffee, the polite flight attendant's offer of breakfast. Above the clouds, the light was too bright, too clean. I pulled the shade down, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence. An hour before landing, I opened the group chat. Typed the simplest request I could think of: "Flight lands at 3 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" I watched the typing dots blink, vanish, return. And then the first reply appeared. "We're busy. Try Uber." The words sat on the screen like ice. 2 minutes later, another bubble. "Why didn't you plan better?" No greeting. No question about the funeral, just that. I stared at the tiny seat back screen in front of me. Its reflection showed my face, pale, lips dry, eyes rimmed red. The folded flag lay across my lap, heavier than the plane itself. The flight descended through a sheet of cloud. The windows fogged at the edges. I pressed my palm to the glass, felt the cold seep into my skin. Passengers shifted around me, pulling coats from overhead bins, laughing about their connections, their dinner plans. No one knew my destination was silence. When we landed, the aisle filled with bodies eager to leave. I stayed seated, letting them pass. The flag was still against my chest, my fingers hooked in its tight folds. At the terminal, the air was warmer but stale. Jet fuel mixed with burnt coffee. Announcements echoed off the walls, words tumbling over each other. I followed the crowd toward baggage claim, though I had nothing to collect. Families clustered near the carousel. Hugs, tears, voices cracking. A toddler clung to her father's neck like she'd never let go. I walked past them all, through the sliding glass doors. The March wind slapped my face, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I tightened my grip on the flag and scanned the curb. No one. No familiar face waving me over. Just taxi drivers, ride-share pickups, the hiss of bus brakes. My phone was still in my hand. I could have called someone. I could have sent a follow-up. Instead, I locked the screen and slipped it into my pocket. The minutes stretched. A bus idled nearby, its engine a low, constant growl. Somewhere across the lane, a suitcase toppled from a cart, spilling clothes onto the pavement. No one moved to help. That's when I saw the black SUV. It slowed as it approached, windows dark, paint shining like oil. The driver stepped out, straightened his jacket, and opened the back door without a word. 3 Marines emerged. 2 women, 1 man. Uniforms crisp, metals catching the gray light. They didn't smile. They just positioned themselves around me, a silent formation between me and the curb. One of them, the tallest, stepped forward. "Mom," he said, voice steady. "We'll walk you in." It wasn't a question. The cold lifted off me as they closed ranks. Boots hitting the concrete in sync, the sound sharp and certain. People glanced over, some whispering, others moving aside. The driver took the flag from my arms for just a moment, easing me into the back seat. He handed it back like it was made of glass. The leather was cool against my legs, the air faintly smelling of pine and something metallic. Through the tinted window, I watched the terminal fade. Couples hugging, children tugging at hands. The life I thought would meet me here. No one spoke in the SUV. No small talk. Only the hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing, slow and measured. At my building, the Marines stepped out first, scanning the sidewalk like we were still on base. They didn't linger. A nod. A quiet, "We've got you," from the woman on my right. Then they were gone. I set the flag on the kitchen table, its corners perfect, edges tight. The apartment was still, the kind of still that echoes. That night I didn't post anything, didn't text anyone. But at 9:02 p.m., the news lit up living rooms across the city. The anchor's voice was calm, practicey. Today, a widow returned from her husband's funeral alone, but not unnoticed. The footage rolled. Me stepping from the black SUV, Marines at my side, flag in my arms. The camera zoomed as I handed a small white box to the tallest Marine. Then the screen filled with my handwriting. If you ever find yourself standing alone at the edge of grief, don't look for the people who left you there. Look for the ones who show up anyway. They didn't use my full name. They didn't have to. In kitchens and living rooms I knew well, forks froze in mid-air, a wine glass clinked hard against tile. No words from them. Not yet. The group chat went silent. No reactions. No apologies. But silence tells its own story, and theirs was starting to unravel. By morning, the clip was everywhere. My phone buzzed on the counter, screen lighting with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. A neighbor from 3 buildings over. A woman I'd met once at a base potluck. A retired sergeant's wife from 2 states away. All saying the same thing: "I saw you last night. You stood so strong." I poured coffee, let it go cold. The steam curled once, then vanished. Every time the phone lit up, I felt the weight of the flag on the table again. By noon, the local paper had reposted the footage. The headline was simple: "Widow returns alone, escorted by Marines." Comments flooded under it. Strangers defending me. Strangers condemning whoever had left me there. They didn't know names. They didn't need to. Mid-afternoon, my sister-in-law's text came. Short. "Was that you on Channel 5? No question mark at the end. Just the words." I didn't answer. Later, a screenshot landed in the group chat. Someone had posted an old photo. Me and my brother as kids, holding hands at a 4th of July parade. The caption, "Family above all, always." It was my mother's account. I didn't react, but others did. The first reply under her post was blunt. "You didn't even pick her up from the airport." It got shared. And shared again. That's when I knew the control was slipping from their hands. They'd built a version of our family story, neat and polished. Now the edges were fraying, and people were looking closer. By evening, a local veterans group reached out. They wanted to thank the Marines who escorted me. They wanted to thank me for showing what dignity looked like. I agreed to meet them the next day. Not for speeches. Not for cameras. Just to stand in a room where the air wasn't heavy with pretense. The group chat stayed quiet. Every so often, I'd see the typing dots appear, then vanish. Like they couldn't decide which version of themselves to be. I didn't rush them. Silence, I'd learned, can do the work for you. The veterans' hall smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage draped in the flag. The people who gathered weren't polished for cameras. They wore denim, faded caps, jackets with patches stitched from decades of service. When I stepped in, conversations paused. Not out of awkwardness, but out of recognition. They knew exactly what the last week had been for me. No one asked for details. They didn't need them. A woman in her 60s came forward, her handshake firm. "Welcome home," she said, like it was the most natural thing. I hadn't heard those words from anyone with my last name. We talked over paper cups of coffee. Stories spilled. Deployments, empty chairs at Christmas, the way homecomings can split a heart open in both directions. No pity, just presence. Someone passed around a laptop showing the clip again. They laughed softly at the precision of the Marines' escort, nodded at the way I held the flag. "You stood like you'd been standing your whole life?" one man said. I didn't tell him it was the first time I'd felt steady in days. Outside, a wind rattled the flag on the pole. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another screenshot. This time from my brother's account, a photo of him with friends at a backyard cookout. Caption: "Life's too short for drama." The comments were mixed. Some cheered him on. More than a few asked if he was the one in that news story. It was spreading further than they could contain. That evening, a local radio station called. They wanted a short interview, live on air. I said no. Not yet. But I agreed to let them mention the Veterans Hall meeting. By the next morning, it was on their website. Photo of me between two older vets, all of us in coats, the caption reading, "Community steps in where family didn't." It wasn't revenge. It wasn't strategy. It was simply the truth moving faster than their version. The group chat still didn't light up. But I knew they were watching. I could feel it in the pauses, in the way certain mutual friends suddenly reached out to check in. Every mile I put between us now felt less like running away and more like walking into some place I should have been all along. The email came early, before the sun had cleared the blinds. Subject line: "Interview request, evening news." The body was short, formal. They'd seen the clip. They wanted to give me a voice. I stared at it while my coffee went cold. A week ago, I was invisible to everyone who shared my last name. Now strangers wanted to put me in front of a camera. At first, I thought about saying no. I wasn't ready to unpack years of quiet cuts and deliberate exclusions on live television. But then I remembered my husband's last letter. "If something ever happens to me, don't let silence win." So I called the producer. Her voice was warm, efficient. They'd set aside 6 minutes in the broadcast. No montage, no background music, just me. The days before the taping moved differently. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months sent messages. The veterans group dropped off flowers. Even the woman from the corner store slipped a note into my bag, "Proud of you." But the group chat stayed dark. On the day of the interview, the studio felt colder than outside. Bright lights hung overhead, washing the color from everything. The anchor shook my hand, looked me in the eye longer than most people do. When the cameras rolled, he asked, "What happened when you landed?" I could have told him about the hours in the air, the way the clouds looked like concrete. Instead, I said, "I buried my husband with honor and came home to silence." The control room stayed still. Even the anchor didn't glance at his notes. I talked about the text from my brother, the follow-up from my mother. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't name them. But I made it clear, blood alone doesn't make someone family. Presence does. When it was over, the anchor thanked me. The crew avoided the usual small talk, just offered nods. Outside, the air felt warmer. I walked to my car with the flag in my arms, same as the day at the airport. A few passers-by recognized me, but no one intruded. That night, I didn't watch the segment live. But I knew who would. And I knew exactly which kitchens and living rooms would be too quiet while it aired. The segment aired at 6 p.m., prime time, 6 minutes of unbroken footage, no music, no cuts. By 6:07, my phone was a hive. Dozens of messages stacking faster than I could read them. Some were just 3 words. I get it. Others told stories. Arrivals to empty curbs, hospital stays without visitors, the echo of doors closing. Veterans wrote. Widows wrote. People who had never worn a uniform but understood what it was to be left behind. Every message carried the same undercurrent. I thought it was just me. I scrolled until my thumb ached. Somewhere in the stream was my sister-in-law's name. A single line. Didn't realize it was that serious. I stared at it, the way you stare at a crack in the wall you've seen for years but never fixed. As if grief needs to RSVP. I didn't reply. The next morning, the interview had been clipped and shared across multiple platforms. Local radio replayed the audio. A community blog wrote a piece titled, "When Silence Speaks Louder Than Blood." It spread faster than anything my family could contain. At lunch, a stranger stopped me outside the grocery store. She said her husband had died 3 years ago. Her voice shook when she said, "You made me feel less alone." She didn't linger, just squeezed my arm and walked away. That night, the group chat lit up for the first time in days. A message from my brother. "You should have told us you needed a ride." I read it twice, laughed once. Then deleted the thread. The truth was out now. Not because I'd screamed it, because I'd let the camera see exactly what happened without flinching. In the days that followed, invitations arrived. Memorial events, veterans fundraisers, panel discussions about support for military spouses. I said yes to most. Not to prove anything to the people who left me at the curb, but to stand in rooms where my presence was wanted. Each time I walked into one, I felt the gap widen. Between the family I was born into and the family I was building in their absence. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. But it was a map, and I was starting to see exactly where it would lead. The shift came faster than I expected. One morning, I woke to find my mother's name trending. Locally, but still. It was tied to a photo she'd posted of me and my brother as kids, the one she'd tried to use as a shield. Comments had piled under it, and the tone had turned. Some defended her. Most didn't. Screenshots of the news clip appeared in threads, side by side with her smiling caption. People asked, "Why weren't you at the airport?" No answer ever came. By noon, she called. I let it ring. Her voicemail was careful, almost rehearsed. "We should talk, people are misunderstanding." I didn't delete it. I didn't return it either. That evening, I stepped out to buy groceries. At the end of the produce aisle, I saw my brother. Hands in pockets, head low. He looked up, startled, as if he'd been caught somewhere he didn't belong. "Rachel," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a test. I kept my hands on the cart. "Hi," I said, nothing more. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat. "You know it didn't have to go like this." The words were soft, but the edge was there. "It went exactly how it had to," I said, and walked past. At home, the flag was still on the table, its sharp edges catching the last light from the window. I traced one fold with my finger, thinking of how precision can hold both beauty and danger. The next morning, a journalist I trusted reached out. She wanted a follow-up piece, my side in my own words. It was tempting. But I'd learned something in the last week. Sometimes the most powerful statement is what you choose not to say. I sent her a short reply. Not yet. Not day. Letters started arriving. Real ones, envelopes addressed by hand. Some from people who'd seen the news, some from names I didn't recognize. They carried stories. About grief, about being left behind, about finding a new circle when the old one closes. Every letter felt like a step further from the people who had left me at that curb, and closer to something I hadn't had in a long time: belonging. So tell me, if you were in my place, with the truth in your hands, and the world finally listening, would you speak it now or wait? I want to know what you'd do, and why. By the end of that week, the air felt charged. Not with grief. Grief had its own slow weight, but with something sharper. Expectation. People seemed to be waiting for me to do the next big thing. Post a statement. Name names. Call them out. I didn't. Instead, I went back to the Veterans Hall. The same smell of coffee and old wood greeted me. The same quiet nods. No one asked about my family. They asked how I was sleeping. They asked if I was eating. Midway through the meeting, my phone lit with a text from my mother. A single line. Let's fix this before it gets worse. E for her. Worse meant public image. For me, worse had already happened the moment I stood alone at the curb. I slipped the phone back into my bag. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of unopened letters. Some envelopes were thick, stuffed with pages. Others were small, one folded sheet. I opened them one by one, hands shaking, eyes burning. A widow from Kansas wrote about coming home to an empty driveway after her husband's burial. A man from Oregon described watching his sister's so-called friends disappear after her cancer diagnosis. Different details, same wound. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, I knew I wasn't going to waste my breath on convincing people who had already chosen not to show up. My voice would be better used somewhere it could actually land. The next morning, I called the journalist back. I'm ready to talk, I said. But not about them. Not by name. She didn't hesitate. Tell me what you do want to talk about. And I did. About the Marines. About the strangers who had stood in the cold with me. About how presence, real, physical, inconvenient presence, was the only thing that mattered. When we hung up, I felt lighter. Not because I'd told my side, in the way the world expected, but because I'd decided which story I wanted to live in. Theirs was shrinking. Mine was just beginning. It started with a slip. I was at the post office, picking up a package too big for the regular mailbox. The clerk handed me a padded envelope, no return address. The handwriting was familiar, but I couldn't place it. Inside was a photo. Glossy, edges curled from handling. My brother and my mother, standing in front of a restaurant I knew well. The date stamp in the corner matched the day of my flight home. They weren't busy. They were celebrating. I stared at the image until the counter blurred. In the background, a group of people I recognized. Extended family, a couple of their friends. Smiles wide, champagne flutes in hand. The caption on the back, scrawled in my mother's writing: perfect day. The envelope didn't have a note. Didn't need one. When I got home, I set the photo on the table beside the flag. Two artifacts from the same day, telling completely different stories. Later, I remembered something my sister-in-law had said weeks earlier, in passing, when I was still numb. Your brother didn't think you'd really need anyone there. At the time I let it slide, too tired to press. Now, the words landed like a stone dropped in still water. I went to my desk and pulled out an old planner. Flipped to that week. There, in my mother's handwriting, faint but unmistakable, was an entry on my arrival date: lunch Dullos and Markin S. Don't forget cake. They'd written me out of that day before it ever happened. I sat back, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint tick of the wall clock. The air felt heavier, like it carried more truth than I'd wanted to know. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't bad timing. It was a choice. And now I had proof, not for the public, Not for some dramatic reveal, but for myself, something I could hold when the temptation came to second. Guess what I felt that day at the curb? The photo lay there, face up, my brother's grin frozen, the flag beside it, still tight in its folds. Two versions of family, side by side, neither willing to touch the other. That night, I couldn't sleep. The photo kept pulling me out of the dark, like a small light I didn't want but couldn't turn off. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Laughing, glasses raised, the midday sun hitting the windows behind them. I could almost hear the clink of cutlery, the sound of a cake knife on porcelain. The apartment was too quiet. The flag on the table seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. I ran my hand over its sharp folds, feeling the difference between discipline and cruelty. This wasn't just absence. It was erasure. I thought back to the funeral, how they'd spoken in low voices, how no one had offered to drive me back to the hotel. It wasn't grief making them distant. It was convenience. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I decided I wouldn't confront them. Not directly. The story they told themselves was more fragile than they knew. And fragile things crack on their own. Instead, I would redirect my energy to the people who had shown up, to the ones whose absence had nothing to do with neglect, only geography. The first step was simple, a small notebook. I wrote down names, Marines' neighbors, veterans, even strangers who had sent letters. Beside each name, a note about what they'd done, brought food, held my hand, walked beside me in the cold. By the time the sun came up, the list filled 2 pages. I slipped the photo into the back of the notebook, not as a reminder of pain, but as a compass, pointing away from what I'd lost, toward what I could build. The hum of the refrigerator was steady now. I made coffee, watching the steam rise and fade. Somewhere out there, they were probably still trying to manage the optics, still wondering if I'd move on. I would. But not the way they meant. Quiet justice isn't about shouting the truth. It's about living it so clearly that the lie can't stand in the same room. I closed the notebook, set it next to the flag. 2 artifacts, 2 futures. And I knew exactly which one I'd carry forward. The rain started just after midnight. It tapped against the kitchen window, soft at first, then harder, like it was trying to get in. I sat at the table, a single lamp on, the rest of the apartment in shadow. The flag was where it always was, centered, precise, untouchable. Sleep wasn't coming. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the restaurant photo. Their smiles, the cake knife cutting through frosting while my plane descended through clouds. I poured another cup of coffee, though the first was still half full. The bitter steam curled up into my face, sharp enough to make my eyes sting. It kept me anchored. Somewhere in that hour between night and morning, I started writing. Not letters to them. Those would never be sent. But outlines of something new. A project. An answer. I listed what I wished had been there for me when I stepped off that plane A ride. A meal I didn't have to cook, someone to just sit with me in the silence. Then I wrote down the names from my notebook. Beside each, I added a role they could play if they wanted. Driver, meal prep, outreach. The page began to fill, not with grief, but with structure. At 20:13 a.m., I caught my reflection in the dark window. Hair pulled back, eyes tired but focused. I didn't look like someone waiting for closure anymore. I looked like someone building something. The rain eased, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional drip from the eaves outside. The quiet wasn't heavy now. It was useful. I could hear my own thoughts without the static of hurt. I made a column for resources. Another for possible partners. Veterans groups, local churches, even the corner store owner who'd left me a note. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I realized this wasn't just a list. It was the skeleton of a network. I pushed the restaurant photo farther away on the table. It didn't deserve the center anymore. When the first light bled into the sky, I was still at the table. The plan wasn't finished, but it was alive. And for the first time since that day at the airport, so was I. By 5 a.m., the pages were scattered across the table, some covered in neat bullet points, others messy with arrows and half-formed thoughts. The coffee pot was empty. I'd stopped tasting it hours ago. My hands smelled faintly of ink from the pen, the kind Liam always kept in his desk drawer. I pulled my laptop closer, the screen lighting the dim room. Searched for local veteran organizations. Browsed volunteer registries. Every click felt like moving one brick from the wall they'd built around me. I found an old email from a Marine who had walked me to the SUV that day. It was just 3 lines, thanking me for letting them escort me home. At the bottom, his phone number. I added his name to the contact first column. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and dark. The first bus hissed past, headlights catching droplets on the window. Somewhere, people were waking up to start ordinary days. Mine wasn't going to be ordinary again. Around 6, I stood to stretch. My legs ached from sitting so long. The kitchen smelled of stale coffee and rain-soaked air. I opened the window just enough to let in the chill. The flag still sat in the center of the table, but now it was surrounded by something new. Pages of possibility. Not just ideas, but actions I could take without waiting for anyone's permission. I sorted them into piles. Immediate steps. Future plans. People to reach out to this week. The restaurant photo was still there, face down now. It had lost its pull. It was just evidence, no longer the centerpiece. I thought about calling my mother, telling her what I'd discovered. The urge evaporated as quickly as it came. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about building something they couldn't erase, something that existed entirely outside their reach. As the sun finally edged over the rooftops, the kitchen felt warmer. Not from the light, but from the momentum gathering in my chest. A different kind of heat. I gathered the pages into a single stack and clipped them together. The first draft of a plan, not perfect, but enough to start. The night hadn't given me sleep. It had given me direction. And for now, that was better. The morning after that sleepless night, I didn't linger in the kitchen. The stack of pages sat on the table, clipped neatly, waiting. I made fresh coffee, the smell sharper than the cold air drifting in from the cracked window. Then I picked up my phone. The first call was to the Marine from the airport. He answered on the second ring. His voice was exactly as I remembered, steady, no wasted words. When I told him about the idea, he didn't pause. Tell me where to be. Next was the local veterans group. They offered their meeting space before I even asked. Said they'd handle refreshments, chairs, whatever was needed. That simple yes loosened something tight in my chest. I sent a few emails. To the neighbor who had dropped off soup, to the woman from the corner store, to 2 widows who had written me long, careful letters. Each message was short. I'm putting something together. I'd like you involved. Every reply came back the same day. Yes. By noon I had the first gathering set for the following week. No press. No fanfare. Just people who knew what it meant to show up when it counted. I spent the afternoon making a checklist. Transportation. Meals. Follow-up calls. The rhythm of it felt familiar, like the lists I used to make for Liam's deployments. But this time, the mission was mine. As the sun slid low, I walked past the flag on the table. It no longer felt like just a reminder of loss. It was a standard. Something to carry forward. I thought about the restaurant photo, still face down in the drawer. That day, they celebrated without me. Next week, I'd be in a room full of people who would have met me at that curb without being asked. I don't need their version of family anymore. I'm building my own, and I want to ask you, if you were going to start something that turned your worst day into someone else's lifeline, what would it be? Tell me. Because one idea, shared at the right time, can change more than you think. The week moved quickly. Each day brought another confirmation. A driver volunteered his van for pickups. A bakery offered trays of sandwiches at cost. Someone from the veterans group promised to bring folding tables and a sound system. I kept the list taped to the refrigerator, adding check marks in thick, black pen. It was the first thing I saw in the morning, the last thing at night. Every line filled felt like reclaiming a piece of ground. One afternoon, I stopped by the meeting space. The room was plain: white walls, scuffed linoleum, windows that let in more cold than light. But I could see it already: chairs in neat rows, a long table with coffee and food, a flag in the corner. Not just a gathering, but a welcome. On the way out, I met the building's janitor, a man in his 70s with a slow, careful walk. When I told him what we were planning, he smiled. "My brother never had that," he said. Then he pulled a set of spare keys from his pocket. "Use the back door if you need extra time." At home, I organized name tags and sign in sheets. Small things, but they made it real. The restaurant photo stayed buried in the drawer. I didn't need to look at it anymore to remember why this mattered. The night before the event, I loaded my car with boxes. Cups, paper plates, a stack of pamphlets the veterans group had printed. The trunk closed with a solid thud, the sound of readiness. I stood for a moment in the driveway, hands in my coat pockets, watching my breath rise in the cold. Liam would have approved of this. He'd have teased me for making too many lists, then stayed up late helping me check them twice. Inside, the flag still occupied the center of the table. I placed the meeting agenda beside it, the two of them like anchor points holding the room steady. Tomorrow, people would walk through that plain back door, into something built entirely out of presents. No one would be left at the curb. Not if I could help it. The morning of the first gathering, the air was sharp with frost. I arrived early, the sun just a pale smear over the rooftops. The back door opened with the janitor's spare key, hinges groaning in the quiet. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and coffee from the pot I'd set to brew. I laid out chairs in neat rows, each one facing the small table at the front. Name tags went on the sign in table next to a stack of paper cups. The flag stood in the corner, steady and unflinching. By the time the clock hit 9, the first car pulled into the lot. Then another, and another. People stepped out, clutching coats against the cold, faces tentative at first, then softening when they saw others walking the same way. I greeted each person at the door. Some hugged me without asking. Others shook my hand like it meant something weightier than a greeting. We started simply. Coffee poured. Sandwiches unwrapped. A hum of conversation filling the space. No speeches, no agenda, just being in the same room. Then, one by one, stories began to surface. A man in his 50s spoke about driving 2 hours to pick up a fellow vet who had no one waiting. A woman told of returning from her deployment to find her apartment emptied by someone she thought she could trust. The words were steady, but the air carried their weight. I didn't speak much. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about giving the people in that room the thing I hadn't had: presence, without condition. At some point, I looked around and realized every chair was filled. Some people stood at the back, cups in hand, listening. The hum of voices was warm, steady, like the sound of a house that's fully lived in. In the middle of it all, someone had placed a small framed photo on the coffee table, a young soldier, smiling in the sun. No caption, no explanation. Just there, like a quiet reminder of why we'd shown up. By noon, I knew this was more than a meeting. It was proof that the absence I'd been given could be replaced. Not by the same people, but by better ones. When we cleaned up, hands moved together, stacking chairs, sealing leftovers, wiping tables. The last to leave was the Marine from the airport. He clasped my shoulder and said, "You did this." For the first time in weeks, I believed him. After the last door closed, I stood in the center of the room. The chairs were stacked, the coffee pot empty, crumbs scattered across the tablecloth. The flag in the corner caught the late afternoon light, its shadow stretched long on the wall. I walked to the table where the small, framed photo still sat. No one had claimed it. I turned it over. Blank back, no inscription. Whoever brought it had left it as an offering, not a keepsake. The air was warm from all the bodies that had filled it. Still, I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the shift inside me. What we'd built today couldn't be taken back. It was here now, breathing. I gathered the leftover sandwiches and coffee grounds, loaded them into my car. The drive home was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. My hands rested on the wheel, steady. At home, the kitchen felt smaller than it had that morning. The flag was still on the table, but now it shared space with the sign, in sheet from the meeting. Names written in every available line, some spilling into the margins. I traced the first few signatures, recognizing most. Then my hand stopped on one near the bottom. The letters were small, careful. I read it twice before I believed it. My sister-in-law's name. She hadn't spoken to me at the meeting. If she was there, she'd stayed in the background, just listening. But her name was proof enough. I didn't call her. Didn't send a message. This wasn't the time for that. She'd come into the space I'd built on her own. That was enough. For now, I set the sign and sheet beside the flag. 2 artifacts from the same day, this time telling the same story. As night fell, my phone buzzed with messages from attendees. Thank yous, offers to help next time, even a few photos from the morning. One showed the entire room mid-conversation. Faces turned toward each other, hands gesturing in the air. It looked like a family, but better. I left the photo from the meeting hall on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow I'd frame it and hang it above the desk. Not as a trophy, but as a marker. The day the absence ended. Somewhere across town, I imagined my sister-in-law telling someone where she'd been that morning. Maybe they'd ask why. Maybe she'd find an answer she didn't expect. Either way, the balance had shifted, and I had no intention of tipping it back. The ripple began the next morning. I woke to 3 new emails from people I'd never met. One from a military spouse in another state, asking if she could start a chapter there. One from a retired pilot who wanted to donate air miles for emergency travel. And one from a man who said simply, "I'll drive. Anywhere. Anytime." By noon, the veterans group posted photos from the gathering. Within hours, they'd been shared dozens of times. The comments were full of strangers tagging friends, saying, "This is what we needed years ago." At the grocery store, the cashier leaned forward and said, "I saw the pictures. You looked lighter." I hadn't realized it, but she was right. Some of the weight had shifted, gone somewhere else. Back home, I sat at the table with the flag and the sign, in sheets still side by side. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. Every name on that sheet was a voice I could call on now. That afternoon, a message popped up on my phone. No name, just a number I didn't recognize at first. Then I scrolled up, my brother's. It was short, "Heard you're doing something big. She went." I didn't answer. Let him wonder. Later, the janitor from the meeting hall called. Said someone had dropped off an envelope for me. When I picked it up, it was sealed, no return address. Inside was a small donation in cash and a folded note. For the next one. No thanks needed. I sat in my car holding that envelope, watching the rain bead on the windshield. Some part of me knew it might be from her. But I didn't unfold the thought too far. Some truths work better when they're left in the corner of your eye. That night, I updated the notebook. New names, new offers, a growing map of something that now had its own momentum. I didn't have to push as hard, the current was moving on its own. Somewhere in that, I realized the real shift. I wasn't building this to prove anything to the people who left me at the curb. I was building it so no one else would have to stand there alone in the first place. And that was a kind of justice they couldn't touch. It didn't take long for the news to reach them. A mutual cousin posted about the gathering, tagging the veterans group. The photos showed a full room, people leaning in, hands on shoulders. The comments below were kind but pointed. "This is what family looks like." By evening, my mother called again. This time, she didn't leave a voicemail. The missed call sat on my screen like a stone I refused to pick up. An hour later, my sister-in-law sent a message. I didn't plan to stay that day. But it felt different. I read it twice, then closed the thread without typing. The next day, a neighbor mentioned she'd seen my brother at the hardware store. He'd been quiet, distracted. left without buying anything. It was a small detail, but I knew him well enough to recognize it for what it was: restlessness. At home, I went through the meeting photos again. In the far corner of one shot, partially hidden, was her, standing near the coffee table, eyes on the floor. She hadn't spoken to me, but she'd been there long enough for the camera to catch her. I printed that photo and slid it into the notebook between pages of new contacts and event plans. Not as a keepsake, but as a marker of a shift. Small, maybe, but real. Later that week, the veterans group invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. I agreed, knowing the invite would likely make its way back to my family. They'd hear about it. They'd picture the room. They'd know they weren't part of it. And maybe that was enough. One evening, as I was locking up the meeting space after a follow-up event, the janitor stopped me. "Someone's been asking when you're here," he said. He didn't give a name. Didn't have to. I could feel the edges of who it might be. Driving home in the dark, I realized the balance had shifted again. They weren't trying to rewrite the story anymore. They were looking for a way back in. But I wasn't the same person they'd left at that curb. And the space I'd built didn't have room for apologies designed to make them feel better. Justice wasn't about shutting them out. It was about keeping the door open only for the people who knew how to walk through it with respect. And right now, they were still standing outside. A year passed faster than I expected. The notebook I started that sleepless night is now thick with pages, names, events, notes scribbled in the margins. The original clip from the airport is still online, but it's been buried under newer images: groups holding signs at arrival gates, strangers hugging at baggage claim, coffee cups clinking in community halls. We call it the Welcome Project now. It has chapters in 6 states. Each one runs on the same simple promise: no one comes home alone. I still keep the flag on my kitchen table, but it's surrounded by new artifacts. A lanyard from our first national meetup. A thank you card from a Gold Star mother. A photo of 2 kids holding a banner at the airport that reads, "We've got you." The work isn't glamorous. It's phone calls, scheduling rides, tracking down spare cribs for a family who lost everything in a fire. But every task feels like a thread in something unbreakable. Sometimes, when I speak at events, people ask if my family ever came around. I tell them the truth. Some stood at the edges, but the center never shifted. And that's fine, because the people in the center now are the ones who earned it. One afternoon, I got a letter from a woman in Maine. She'd been met at the airport by one of our teams. Inside her envelope was a photo. Her, in uniform, stepping into the arms of someone holding a sign with her name. On the back, she'd written, "You gave me back my landing." I keep that photo in the same drawer as the restaurant picture. They don't touch, but they live side by side, a before and an after. Last month, we hit a milestone: our 100th welcome. No press, no speeches. Just a group at the gate holding a handmade banner. The arrivals board clicked over, the doors opened, and another person stepped into a circle they didn't know was waiting for them. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet. Not the kind of quiet that presses on your chest, but the kind that lets you breathe. It struck me that I'd built the thing I'd needed most. And in doing so, I'd stopped needing their approval to know I was worth showing up for. The last welcome of the year was at the same airport where it all began. The winter light was thin, the kind that turns everything silver. I stood near the arrivals gate, holding a sign with someone else's name on it. Not mine. Not anymore. The automatic doors slid open, letting in a gust of cold air and a wave of footsteps. She appeared. A young woman, hair tucked under a knit hat, uniform jacket zipped high. Her eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on me. I stepped forward, offered the sign, and said, "Welcome home." She smiled, small at first, then wider as the rest of the team closed in around her. A circle formed, coats and hands and voices making a soft wall against the terminal noise. For a moment, I saw myself in her. Arms full of weight, head full of silence. And then I saw the difference. She wasn't alone. We walked her to the curb where a car was already waiting. The same spot where I'd once stood with no one. The air smelled of exhaust and winter rain, but it didn't sting this time. After she left, I stayed a while, watching the doors open and close. Travelers came through in pairs, in groups, in silence. Some hugged. Some just kept walking. As I turned to go, I noticed a figure near the far wall. Hands in pockets, head lowered. It was my brother. He didn't move toward me, didn't speak. Just watched as I crossed the terminal. When our eyes met, something passed between us. Not apology, not reconciliation. Recognition, maybe. That the gap between us was no longer his to close. Outside, the cold hit my face, sharp and clean. I walked to my car, the sign still in my hand. The flag was at home, waiting on the table, but I didn't need to see it to feel what it meant. Driving away, I thought about how justice had come. Not in headlines or confrontation, but in the quiet permanence of what we'd built. 100 welcomes. Hundreds more to come. The road stretched ahead, slick with rain and light from the street lamps. I didn't look back. Some stories don't need a return trip, and some endings aren't really endings at all. Just the point where you realize you're already home. Looking back, I realized the story was never just about being left at the curb. It was about what happened next. About refusing to let that moment define the rest of my life. The people who should have shown up didn't. But others did, and in their presence, I found something I'd been missing far longer than I knew, proof that I was worth the space I took up. The Welcome Project started as a handful of names in a notebook. Now, it's a lifeline that stretches across states, connecting people who may never meet but understand each other instantly. That's the real justice. Building something they can't erase. Something that exists whether they ever approve or not. I learned that closure doesn't come from an apology or from someone finally seeing your worth. It comes from showing up for yourself first, and then for others who need it. You don't wait at the curb for the wrong people to arrive. You go find the right ones. And when they ask, years from now, how it all began, I'll tell them the truth. It started the day my flight landed and nobody came. It became a story of never letting that happen to anyone else. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a full room, a warm cup of coffee, and a hand at your elbow when you step into the unknown. And that quiet can be louder than anything they ever said or didn't say.